pumping units. I'm going to tell you all about them. It's a brand new invention. Now, this is nothing new. This is going to be either a refresher or an introduction, or if anything, perhaps I'll end with a fun mind teaser on pumping units. But I just wanted to go through and talk about some different geometries of the beam pumping units that are out there. And most of this John Laney made, so I don't take any credit for it like that. But there's some fun modifications that you start to see out in the world today. That one to me looks like a wasp about to sting somebody. But that, and then there are bent beam pumping units. These types I'm not going to really talk about today because I don't really see many of them. Although, there is one that looks like this. It's on 158 just south of KD's, my favorite restaurant, and it's on the right-hand side. It's a Titan pumping unit. And I sure would one day like to go analyze that thing. But today, we're going to talk about just good old-fashioned, what we're used to, pumping units. And I'm going to assume that everybody in here either knows about all the different things that you call a horse head or a tail bearing or an equalizer bearing, all sorts of stuff like that. So I won't go through all of those little words that we can't even read. Instead, I'm going to focus on the important ones, A, C, I, K, P, R, G, H, X, Y, Z. The API pumping unit dimensions. And the ones I'm going to focus on are listed right here. And they're important because they determine which pumping unit you should use for the type of well you're trying to produce. I very smoothly took this remote and it's not the one. Is there? This one? Okay. So anyway, to put a little unnecessary math that's in there, a pumping unit is just a 4-bar linkage system, and it takes the rotating motion of the motor and turns it into reciprocating motion at the polish rod. It's you can find these 4-bar linkage systems in very old physics books, so it's kind of neat that this is a real-world application of that 4-bar linkage system. Just some of the types: conventional, enhanced conventional, beam balance, Mark IIs, and air balance. Those are the beam pumping unit types. I won't talk about beam balance today, because you can essentially get a good idea about them when you talk about conventional units. Some non-beam types are like the one you just saw before, Rotaflex, strapjacks, things like that. But we're going to concentrate on those top squares today. So just one thing I want to get out is when I talk about clockwise or counterclockwise, it is wellhead to the right, and then you determine the rotation. So it does matter what side you drive the truck up to the pumping unit. All right. And also, I'm going to be using a word called torque factor all day long. Torque factor this, torque factor that. Actually, it won't be all day. It'll be for the next 15 minutes. But still, what do I mean by torque factor? Well, I mean exactly what you just read while I was talking. It is a factor that you multiply the load at the polish rod by to get the torque at the gearbox that's imposed by the rods. Of course, the counterbalance opposes this by those counterweights going the other way, so you have a net torque between the rods and the counterbalance, and it's that net torque that you try to keep below 110%, right? Right. Okay. 2 years ago, I would have said 100%. Now it's 110, and I'm sure it'll continue growing. But anyway, as you know, I have to stick an equation in there, otherwise I wouldn't feel complete. So there's my equation. But that's the equation for net torque. And that TF of theta, that talks about the torque factor of the pumping unit at a certain angle of those crank arms. So with beam pumping units, the torque factor changes all the time between upstroke, downstroke, and everywhere in between. So that torque factor rises and falls, and it shows you how much of an impact that polished rod load has on creating a torque at the gearbox. And the other sine function right there, that has to do with the cranks going around in their circle and the opposing torque that they put on the rod torque, so that the difference between them is in fact that net torque. All right, so what can we do with the torque factor? Well, for dorks like me, we can make things called permissible load diagrams, okay? And what are they? Well, they're the easiest way to determine whether or not your pumping unit A is the right one for the job, and B, if your pumping unit is going to be overloaded, or if it's rod heavy, or if it's weight heavy, all sorts of stuff. So you can instantly identify if you're going to have a problem with a certain pumping unit with a given well. What are these diagrams? Well, I just said. But anyway, what you do with these things is you overlay them on top of the surface card, and that gives you an instantaneous qualitative feel of what's going to happen with your pumping unit. All right, so here we go. You take your equation. I lied. I guess there's two equations. But you insert for net torque. I'm sure there's an annoying laser on here. On this one? Yeah. The top. Ha! Oh, it's green. Okay, so you take your net torque, you set that equal to the gearbox rating, and you take the weight at the polish rod and you make that your permissible load and you solve it through and a bunch of magic happens and you have your load that is permissible at the polished rod for that given crank angle. And then you plot all those loads and that'll give you your permissible load diagram. And so like I just said, that second bullet talks about an affinity for the pumping unit. What does the pumping unit like? Does it like a card that goes up to the right? Does it like a card that goes down to the right? Does it like level surface card? What kind of rods are going to be more beneficial for the pumping unit you use? How about the size of pump? How fast should it go? All these types of things you can answer by looking at permissible load diagrams and putting the right pumping unit to the well that you're going to produce. And like that bottom bullet says, in real life you may have only certain pumping units in your inventory, so you have to manipulate how that surface card is going to look so that the pumping unit that you have to choose from will work for the well that you are ordered to design. All right, so we're going to discuss different permissible load diagrams for each pumping unit. Since I've only got a few minutes, I just chose a typical 10,000 foot well with an 86 rod string with some sinker bars, and all the pumping units, the air balance, the Mark II, the conventional, they're all going to be 640, 365, 144, and the long hole, that's what I'm going to use. And so I'm going to start with good old trusty conventional.